When Adana came home tired from work, she found her mother sitting with her sister Ngozi, both grinning as if they had good news. Her mother proudly said she had made a family decision. She had promised Adana's apartment to Ngozi as a wedding gift. Adana stood still, her heart racing. That apartment was not only hers, it was already rented out to tenants who trusted her and had signed long contracts. Her mother thought love and guilt would make her agree, but Adana wasn't a little girl anymore. She had proof, receipts, deeds, and agreements that showed the truth. Ngozi clapped her hands in excitement, already imagining the apartment as her new home, but Adana didn't join in the celebration. Instead, she sat quietly, her mind calm and sharp. She remembered every late night she worked, every bill she paid, and how hard she fought to keep that apartment standing. It wasn't just a building. It was her independence, her sweat, and her pride. As her mother kept talking, Adana knew one thing for sure: no promise made behind her back would take away what she had built with her own hands. This time, she was ready to fight back. Sunday lunch was supposed to be warm and cheerful, with plates of jollof rice and laughter filling the air, but that day the meal carried a different kind of heat. Adana had barely taken her seat when her mother cleared her throat and stood tall, her face glowing with pride. "I have an announcement," she said, her eyes moving around the table before resting on Ngozi. "My daughter Ngozi will soon be moving into her apartment. It will be her wedding home." Her voice was loud, expecting claps and cheers. Relatives began nodding, some even smiling, and Ngozi leaned closer to her fiancé, squeezing his hand like she had just won a prize. But Adana didn't smile. She didn't clap. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a plain brown folder. Slowly, without saying a word, she placed it in the center of the table. Everyone's eyes followed her hand. The room grew quiet as she opened it and pushed the papers across the table. They were contracts, signed, sealed, stamped, and notarized. The bold dates and signatures screamed louder than any argument could. The tenants had every right to stay in that apartment for years. The noise of spoons against plates stopped. Even the air felt still. Her mother's smile faltered, and Ngozi blinked rapidly, confused. Her fiancé leaned forward, scanning the papers, his face tightening with every page he turned. "Wait, so the apartment isn't free?" he asked slowly, his voice breaking the silence. His words fell heavy on the table. Ngozi pulled the papers toward her, her fingers trembling. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising. But Adana stayed calm, her eyes steady. "These are legal agreements. My tenants are protected by law. No one is leaving that apartment just because you made a promise." Her mother's face flushed red. "Adana, how dare you embarrass me in front of everyone," she hissed. But the room was already shifting. Relatives who had been smiling now exchanged awkward glances. A cousin cleared his throat and looked down at his plate. The proud announcement had turned into a moment of shame. Ngozi's fiancé leaned back in his chair, his hand slipping away from hers. His silence was louder than his words. He had been expecting a beautiful wedding home, but now he realized it was nothing more than a fantasy. The tension wrapped around the table, choking out any laughter or chatter. Adana didn't raise her voice or argue. She simply folded her hands on her lap and let the truth sit there for everyone to see. The papers spoke for her, and the silence that followed was more powerful than anything she could have said. When the meal ended, no one clapped, no one congratulated. Plates were pushed aside half-eaten, and the joy that usually filled the Sunday lunch was gone. For the first time, her family saw that the apartment wasn't a toy to be passed around or a promise to be gifted away. It was hers, and the truth was undeniable. The days after the Sunday lunch were heavy with tension. Adana thought her mother might calm down once she saw the contracts, but instead things only got worse. Her mother showed up at her door early in the morning, her voice sharp and angry. "Adana, enough games. You will evict those people immediately. Do you hear me? Your sister needs that house for her marriage. She spoke as if she had the final say, as if her words could erase the signatures and laws that protected the tenants. Ngozi stood beside her, arms folded, eyes full of fire. Adana listened quietly, her face calm though her heart pounded. She knew her mother was used to shouting down problems, but this time was different. When her mother pushed further, threatening to go there herself and throw those tenants out, Adana slowly walked to her table and picked up an envelope. Without raising her voice, she placed it in her mother's hand. Before you do anything, she said softly, read this. Her mother frowned and pulled out the folded paper inside. As her eyes moved over the words, the color drained from her face. It was a legal notice from court, clearly stating that Adana's tenants were protected by tenancy law. They could not be forced out without due process, and any attempt to do so would be a criminal offense. The warning was printed in bold letters: anyone harassing or trying to evict them illegally could face charges. Ngozi snatched the paper, reading quickly, her lips trembling with frustration. What is this nonsense? She shouted. But the more she read, the more her voice broke. The smug confidence she had carried for weeks slipped away. Her fiancé, who had been silent since the lunch, quietly muttered, "This doesn't look good," before stepping back, as if distancing himself from the storm. Adana looked at her mother, her voice steady but full of weight. If you or anyone else tries to touch my tenants, it won't be them in trouble. It will be you. The law is clear, and I will not hesitate to use it. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. The power was in her calmness, in the solid truth of the paper in their hands. The room felt colder. For the first time, her mother had no quick answer. The proud, controlling tone was gone, replaced with silence and the faint sound of Ngozi's uneven breathing. The plan that had once seemed so easy, so certain, was crumbling right in front of them. Adana gathered the papers back into the envelope, slipped it into her bag, and stood tall. This conversation is over, she said. Her words cut clean through the air. Her mother and sister stood frozen, their faces pale with panic, as Adana walked away. The battle wasn't just about an apartment anymore, it was about power, and they had just realized the law was not on their side. The sun had barely risen when a loud commotion broke out in front of Adana's apartment. Ngozi had arrived with 2 trucks of movers, shouting orders like a queen claiming her palace. She banged on the gate and yelled at the tenants inside, demanding that they pack up and leave immediately. Her voice was sharp, carrying down the street, waking neighbors from their sleep. The tenants, shocked at first, quickly realized what was happening. Instead of obeying her, they shut the doors, bolted the locks, and gathered together inside. One of them dialed Adana with shaky hands, telling her what was going on. Within minutes, Adana was on her way, but she wasn't alone. She brought a security team and her lawyer. By the time she arrived, the street was buzzing. Neighbors stood outside, whispering, pointing, and recording videos on their phones. They had heard stories of the family drama, but now they were watching it live. Ngozi was still outside, her face red with anger. She shouted at the tenants through the locked doors, calling them squatters and thieves. The movers looked uneasy, glancing at each other, unsure if they should carry boxes into a house that clearly wasn't ready for them. When Adana stepped out of her car, calm and composed, the crowd turned to her. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked past Ngozi, greeted the tenants through the gate, and then turned to her lawyer. The lawyer pulled out a folder of documents, official proof that the tenants were fully protected by the law. Security officers stepped forward, warning Ngozi to back away. But Ngozi wasn't ready to give up her performance. She screamed, "This is my house. My mother promised it to me." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. She waved her arms wildly, trying to convince the crowd that she was the victim. Some neighbors gasped, others shook their heads. The tenants, standing firmly inside, watched with folded arms, their loyalty to Adana unshaken. Adana finally spoke, her words calm but sharp. Ngozi, this is not your house. These tenants live here legally. You cannot force them out. Her lawyer added, if you continue this behavior, you could be arrested for harassment. The movers, sensing trouble, began quietly packing up their things. They didn't want to be caught in the middle of a legal battle. Security officers moved closer to Ngozi, guiding her away from the gate. She fought against them, still screaming, but her cries sounded weaker now. Neighbors recorded every second as she was escorted toward her car, shouting that the house was hers, her face wet with tears and anger. The street buzzed with whispers as Adana reassured her tenants, thanking them for standing strong. For the first time, the power had shifted in public. The neighbors had seen everything. Ngozi's tantrum had turned into humiliation, and Adana's calm strength had won her not only loyalty, but respect. It didn't take long before the whole family heard about the fight over the apartment. Phone calls started coming in, then visits from uncles, aunties, and cousins who all claimed they were just trying to make peace. But the peace they wanted was one-sided. They sat Adana down in her own living room and accused her of being selfish. You're the older sister, one uncle said firmly. It's your duty to help Ngozi start her new life. Why hold on to one house when your sister's marriage depends on it? Another aunt chimed in, your mother gave her word, and as children we must respect that. Family comes first. Their words were sharp, and every pair of eyes in the room seemed to press down on her like heavy stones. Adana sat quietly, letting them speak. She had heard it all before, guilt, tradition, sacrifice. But this time she wasn't a scared little girl. She waited until their voices slowed, then she stood and went to a drawer. From it she pulled out a folder filled with papers. She laid them on the center table one by one, receipts, bills, tax documents, and renovation invoices. Do you see these? She asked, her voice calm but steady. I have been paying for this apartment since my 20s. Rent, repairs, painting, even the leaking roof, every naira came from me. Not from my mother. Not from any of you. From me. The room grew quiet. Some leaned forward, squinting at the papers. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Adana continued, her voice trembling but strong. This is not some family inheritance. My mother never put a cent into it. She never paid for one brick, not one tile. I built this place with my own hard work, while juggling jobs, while sacrificing my own comfort. And now you call me selfish because I refuse to hand it over like a gift. Her words cut through the air, sharper than any shout could. The uncles who had spoken the loudest shifted in their chairs. The aunt who had praised family promises cleared her throat and looked at her lap. Even the cousins who had come ready to side with Ngozi whispered among themselves, realizing the truth they had never been told. Adana pressed her hand on the stack of papers. For years, you all believed a story, that this was some family property. That it was just sitting here waiting to be passed on. But the truth is right here. The only person who ever built anything here is me. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. I won't let anyone take that away, not even my own blood. The silence was heavy. For the first time, the relatives who had come to scold her had nothing to say. Their version of the story had crumbled in front of them, and they couldn't deny it anymore. The house was not a family gift. It was Adana's life, her sweat, her years of sacrifice, and now, they all finally knew it. The family could argue all they wanted about promises and tradition, but Adana knew they would never understand unless she told them the truth. One evening, when yet another group of relatives came to convince her to do the right thing, she finally broke her silence. She sat at the edge of her chair, her hands trembling slightly, and looked at every face in the room. You all think this apartment is just walls, just a building, she began softly. But to me, it is my life. It is my story. They stared at her, some impatient, some curious. She took a deep breath and continued. When I was in my 20s, I worked 2 jobs. I stayed up all night, writing reports, tutoring children, sometimes even selling food on weekends, just to save money. While other people my age were going to parties, I was working, sweating, building something for myself. I wanted freedom from constant control, from being told what I could or couldn't do. This apartment was my escape. It was proof that I could stand on my own. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. She told them about the nights when she came home exhausted, about the months she lived on instant noodles just to save enough for the down payment. She told them how she stood in the rain one day, supervising workers as they fixed the leaking roof because she couldn't afford to hire a contractor. Every corner of that apartment held a memory of her struggle. The painted walls, the repaired floors, even the windows, everything carried a piece of her sacrifice. I built this place, she said, her voice rising, not with promises, but with sweat. Not with family money, but with my own hands. Every time I look at these walls, I see the nights I cried from exhaustion, the mornings I pushed myself out of bed to work again, the freedom I fought for. Her eyes glistened, but she refused to let tears blur her strength. So no, this is not just an apartment. This is me. And nobody has the right to give me away. The room was silent. For the first time, the relatives who had been so loud, so certain, had nothing to say. Even her mother, who always found words to twist situations in her favor, sat with her mouth closed, her eyes shifting nervously. They had always seen Adana as the quiet daughter, the one who never fought back. But now they saw her as a woman who had carried her own burdens, a woman whose independence had been hard-earned, not handed down. Her words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. The apartment was no longer a prize for Ngozi, no longer a tool for her mother's control. Everyone in that room finally saw it for what it truly was, Adana's blood, her sweat, her freedom carved into brick and stone. For once, no one could argue. They could only sit in silence, facing the truth they could no longer ignore. The day of the court hearing felt like a storm was waiting in the air. Adana dressed simply but neatly, carrying a folder that seemed heavier than its papers. Inside were the deeds, receipts, and every document she had collected over the years to prove the truth. Her lawyer walked beside her, calm and confident, while her mother and Ngozi entered the courtroom with their heads high, as if victory was already theirs. Relatives and neighbors who had heard about the family drama filled the benches, curious to see who would win. When the case was called, the judge looked at both sides, his voice firm as he asked for evidence. Adana's mother stood quickly, speaking with the same boldness she always used at home. My daughter promised this house to her sister. It is a family property, and we are here to claim what rightfully belongs to us. Murmurs ran through the crowd, but the judge raised a hand for silence. Then he turned to Adana's lawyer. Her lawyer stood and spoke clearly. Your Honor, this is not a family property. It belongs solely to my client, Adana. She has been the one paying the mortgage, handling the renovations, and covering the taxes. We have documents to prove this beyond any doubt. He walked to the judge's bench and placed the folder down. One by one, the papers were opened, bank statements, tax receipts, signed deeds with Adana's name in bold print. The judge flipped through them carefully before lifting his head. His question was simple, almost too simple. Who pays the mortgage and owns the title? The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone turned to look at Adana's mother, who fidgeted nervously. Ngozi lowered her gaze, her earlier confidence fading. Adana's lawyer replied without hesitation. My client, Adana, pays every bill and owns the title. Here is the proof. The judge leaned back in his chair and nodded. His voice was calm, but it carried finality. Then there is no case. The property belongs to Adana. Anyone making false claims or attempting to force tenants out will face legal consequences. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The sound echoed through the courtroom, sealing the truth. Adana's mother's face turned pale, and for the first time, her voice failed her. Ngozi clutched her bag tightly, her lips pressed together as if holding back tears. They stood slowly, their heads lowered, and walked out of the courtroom in silence. The same relatives and neighbors they had bragged to only weeks before now watched their humiliation unfold. Adana, though her hands still trembled, sat tall. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply gathered her papers, knowing that her years of sacrifice had finally spoken for her. The truth had won, and this time, there was no one left who could deny it. After the courtroom drama, everyone expected Adana to cut ties or seek revenge, but she surprised them all. She went back to her apartment, where her tenants greeted her warmly, thanking her for standing by them. They had been loyal through the chaos, and she decided to keep the apartment exactly as it was. It would remain a safe home for them and a lasting symbol of her independence. But Adana didn't stop there. Quietly, without fanfare, she bought another property. It wasn't as big or as polished as the apartment, but it was hers, bought under her own terms, in her own name, with no strings attached. She didn't give it away as a gift or let anyone else make promises on her behalf. This new property stood as a reminder to herself and her family. Her life was no longer controlled by her mother's words. When her relatives heard about it, some shook their heads in disbelief, but others nodded with respect. Even Ngozi, still bitter from the public humiliation, had no choice but to face the truth. Dreams built on entitlement crumble, while dreams built on hard work last. Adana's story didn't end with revenge or bitterness. It ended with strength, freedom, and a new promise she made to herself: never again would anyone decide her future for her.